You wouldn't expect silence to be expensive. But in Berlin, it cost more than 7 billion euros. For almost a decade, a brand new international airport stood perfectly ready. Terminals built, runways paved, lights glowing, and yet not a single flight ever left the ground. Inside, escalators hummed for no one. The baggage belts turned every morning, not for suitcases, but to stop the motors from rusting. And every evening, a train would arrive from the city, completely empty. No passengers, no staff, just air moving through the tunnels to keep the mold away. It sounds like fiction, but it's real. And what happened here would become one of the most embarrassing engineering failures in modern Europe. But before we talk about the chaos, let's start with the dream. After the Berlin Wall fell, Germany was reborn. East and West finally together. Berlin was no longer a divided city. It was a symbol of unity. But there was a problem. 3 separate airports, all outdated, all remnants of a split nation. 2 in the West, 1 in the East. None capable of carrying a country into the future. So, a decision was made, one bold enough to match the moment. Build a single world-class international hub that would unite both sides of the city. A symbol of progress, efficiency, and pride. Something that said, Berlin is back. Sounds simple, right? That's where the nightmare begins. 6 years. That's how long it took just to decide where to build it. 6 years of political debates, protests, and indecision. And after all that time, they picked a site right next to the old Schönefeld Airport. You can already guess what that meant. Twice the noise, twice the complexity, and 0 fresh start. Still, the plans went ahead. In the 1990s, optimism was the engine that powered everything. Germany wanted to show the world that it could build again, smarter, faster, and cleaner. But what they built instead was chaos. Because here's where it gets messy. The city didn't hire one contractor to oversee the project. Instead, they split it into hundreds of tiny contracts, each handled by a different company, each reporting to someone different. In theory, this would keep costs low. In practice, it created a monster. Nobody knew who was actually in charge. Blueprints didn't match. Electricians followed one plan while architects followed another. It was like trying to assemble a plane mid-flight, with no cockpit and everyone arguing over the manual. And the design itself, that became a war of egos. The lead architect, Meinhard von Gerken, envisioned something functional and elegant. Clean lines, natural light, minimal clutter. But the politicians wanted glamour. They wanted luxury lounges, endless shopping, floors of tax-free retail to boost revenue. So, floors were added, corridors stretched, and every new idea pushed the project further off course. By the time Berlin's mayor demanded that Brandenburg be capable of handling the Airbus A380, the biggest passenger jet in the world, they were designing gates for an aircraft already nearing extinction. And yet, in all that effort to impress, they forgot the basics. No one built proper stands for low-cost carriers, the very airlines that would dominate Europe within a decade. Berlin was trying to build the future while clinging to the past. Deadlines came, deadlines went, but the city kept promising that opening day was just around the corner. Then came 2012, the year it was finally supposed to happen. Invitations printed, champagne chilled, the press waiting, and then disaster. Just weeks before the grand opening, inspectors made a horrifying discovery. The airport's entire fire safety system didn't work. Not partially, not needs a few fixes. It didn't work at all. There was no functioning smoke control, no clear evacuation route, and no operational alarms. In short, the building was a death trap. The opening was canceled. Overnight, billions gone, Germany's reputation shattered. And the story that followed only made it worse. Because what inspectors found after that was beyond belief. Over 120,000 construction defects. 170,000 kilometers of electrical cable installed incorrectly. That's nearly half the distance from Earth to the Moon. Walls that didn't meet code. Escalators that stopped short of the next floor. Corridors that led nowhere. You'd think it was a joke, except it wasn't. Von Gerken was fired. Politicians turned on each other. And the budget exploded from 2 billion euros to 7. Yet no one dared to cancel it. Too much money had already been poured in. Too many careers tied to its survival. So they let it sit. Lights on, security guards patrolling empty halls, trains arriving daily with no passengers. It was too expensive to demolish, too broken to finish, and too symbolic to abandon. And here's the strangest part. For nearly 10 years, Berliners could drive past this massive glowing airport at night and see their reflection in its glass facade, knowing it didn't serve a single flight. It became a running joke across Europe. The country known for precision engineering couldn't even open its own airport. And the longer it stayed closed, the more absurd the story became. Think about it. This was supposed to be Germany's symbol of unity, but it turned into something darker. A mirror of everything the country didn't want to admit. Inefficiency, overregulation, and political pride. Yet somehow, through all the laughter and embarrassment, one truth remained. Berlin still needed its airport. The city was growing, tourism was booming, and Tegel, the old West Berlin airport, was crumbling under the pressure. So Brandenburg couldn't stay dead forever. But when it finally did come to life years later, the timing would be almost comically tragic. Because just as the world's planes were ready to land, something far bigger would ground them all. And that's where the story turns from a disaster into irony. For years, Brandenburg stood frozen in time, a monument to indecision, a reminder that even the most ambitious dreams can sink under their own weight. But behind the locked glass doors, the chaos hadn't stopped. It had simply moved inside. Every few months, a new leader would arrive, promising to finally finish the job. Each brought their own team, their own vision, and their own excuses. And every one of them would leave the same way, exhausted, humiliated, and buried under paperwork. The airport had become a revolving door of authority. No one could fix it, yet no one could walk away from it either. At one point, a former railway executive named Hartmut Maydorn was brought in to clean up the mess. He'd handled Germany's biggest transportation systems before, but even he was stunned by what he found. The blueprints were outdated. Safety systems contradicted each other. Cables ran through walls that no longer existed. Every problem solved seemed to uncover 5 more. He ordered a full audit, and the results were almost unbelievable. Over 500,000 separate faults were identified throughout the airport. 500,000. That wasn't a construction site anymore. It was an open wound. And yet, no one dared to start over. Too much money had been spent. Too many headlines had already branded the project a failure. To scrap it would have meant political suicide. So, they kept patching, repairing, rebuilding the same mistakes again and again, hoping one day it might all somehow fit together. But here's the thing no one expected. Berlin's ghost airport became something else entirely. A cautionary tale. Universities studied it. Economists debated it. Politicians used it as a warning of what happens when bureaucracy crushes innovation. It wasn't just a construction story anymore. It was a psychological one. How long can a nation hold on to a promise it can't deliver? Still, the longer it remained empty, the more surreal it became. Tourists began sneaking past fences just to glimpse it. A perfect, untouched terminal. Sunlight glinting off glass that had never seen a boarding pass. It was almost poetic. A building made to connect people that never connected anyone at all. But time doesn't wait, even for mistakes. By the mid-2000s, Berlin's population had exploded. The old Tegel and Schönefeld airports were suffocating under record traffic, delays stacked up. Passengers spilled into terminals built for half their capacity. The city was literally running out of runway space. Everyone knew what needed to happen. Brandenburg had to open, whether it was ready or not. So the testing began again. Systems were rewired. Safety checks redone. Fire alarms replaced. Even the ventilation network, the one that had triggered the original disaster, was redesigned from the ground up. Billions more were poured in. Engineers spent months simulating smoke just to prove it could be cleared safely. It was slow, frustrating, and painfully expensive. But this time, progress finally began to show. Still, there was no escaping the ridicule. Every missed deadline became front-page news. Every year without an opening was another punchline. Other European airports expanded, upgraded, modernized. Berlin's was still stuck on the ground. And the worst part? Nobody could even agree on who to blame anymore. The architects accused the politicians. The city blamed the contractors. The contractors blamed the planners. Somewhere in that endless finger-pointing, the idea of accountability disappeared completely. What remained was a single uncomfortable truth. The dream of uniting Berlin had turned into a lesson in national embarrassment. But then, just as the engineers began to see light at the end of the tunnel, the world itself went dark. It was 2020. Construction was finally wrapping up, systems were running, and the long-delayed airport was ready for takeoff. After almost 3 decades of planning and failure, Berlin-Brandenburg was finally about to open its doors. And then, a global pandemic hit. Air travel collapsed overnight. Borders slammed shut. Airlines grounded fleets. For most of the aviation world, it was a catastrophe. But for Berlin, it was an opportunity in disguise. Because for the first time, the airport didn't have to face the chaos of millions of passengers flooding in. The pressure was gone. The skies were empty. And that gave them something they hadn't had in 30 years. Time. While other airports were losing money and laying off staff, Brandenburg quietly used the downtime to finish everything it had started. Every malfunction was repaired, every glitch tested again and again. The terminals were polished, the systems calibrated. For the first time, there were no more excuses left. Then, on October 31st, 2020, Berlin-Brandenburg Airport finally opened, after 14 years of construction and 9 years of silence. The irony was cruel. A project delayed by everything imaginable was finally ready, in the 1 year when almost no one was allowed to fly. There were no massive crowds, no grand ceremonies, just a handful of masked passengers stepping into a terminal that had waited decades for this moment. Quiet applause echoed through a space built for millions. But that silence felt different now. It wasn't failure anymore, it was relief. By the time travel slowly returned, Brandenburg had already adapted. Its systems worked. The fire safety passed every test. The baggage systems ran smoothly. After years of mockery, Berlin's ghost airport had finally come to life, quietly, efficiently, and on its own terms. It wasn't the glorious triumph anyone had imagined, but maybe that was fitting. Berlin had always been a city that rebuilt itself through struggle, from ruins, from division, from failure, and Brandenburg Airport became just another reflection of that truth. But while the doors were finally open, the legacy of what came before couldn't just vanish. Billions had been lost, reputations destroyed, and a question still lingered. How did one of the world's most organized nations lose control of a single project for 3 whole decades? That answer would reveal something deeper. A flaw not in the construction, but in the system that built it. For 3 decades, Berlin's airport story had been one long apology. A promise delayed, a dream mocked, and a project buried under headlines that refused to die. But time, as it always does, had one final twist to deliver. Because what began as Germany's most expensive embarrassment would slowly transform into one of its greatest recoveries. By the time the world started flying again, something strange had happened at Brandenburg. The airport that everyone had written off, the one that symbolized everything wrong with modern Germany, began to work. Not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily, quietly. It didn't make the front pages this time. There were no viral photos, no politicians cutting ribbons in front of flashing cameras. It just opened its gates, flight by flight, day by day, and began to do what it was always built to do, connect. But to understand how it got there, you have to look beyond the concrete and cables. Because Brandenburg was never just an engineering project. It was a reflection of the system that built it. Germany's strength had always been in precision, in rules, in structure. But that same precision taken too far becomes paralysis. Every decision needed a committee. Every plan required another signature. And every department, terrified of mistakes, demanded another layer of approval. It was perfectionism turned poisonous. Brandenburg exposed that flaw for the world to see. The problem wasn't that Germany had forgotten how to build. It's that it had forgotten how to decide. But here's the beautiful irony. Out of that chaos, a new kind of discipline emerged. The engineers who stayed through the disaster learned how to build around failure, how to improvise within a rigid system, how to adapt rules instead of being ruled by them. They built not for perfection, but for survival. And in that, Brandenburg found its redemption. Once the dust settled, the airport became a living lesson in resilience. Every system that once broke was redesigned from scratch. Every outdated process was automated. It became one of the first airports in Europe to integrate AI into its daily operations, monitoring traffic flow, tracking aircraft movement, predicting delays before they happened. The same technology that once exposed its flaws was now running its future. It was poetic, in a way. The machine that failed because of human error was finally saved by one that learned from it. And Berlin? The city that once apologized for its airport now takes pride in it. In 2023, Brandenburg won the Airport Innovation Award, a title that would have been unthinkable 10 years earlier. Not because it was perfect, but because it had finally proven that lessons learned through failure can be more valuable than those earned through success. But the real victory wasn't in the awards. It was in the symbolism. Because for a city once divided by walls, Brandenburg became something more than an airport. It became a closure. A physical bridge between East and West, standing where division once ruled. Passengers arriving there today walk through a terminal built on the same soil that once split families in two. That kind of poetry doesn't need to be designed. It simply happens when time heals what history broke. And yet, even as planes take off from Brandenburg's runways, that old silence still lingers. Not the silence of failure anymore, but the kind that exists after a storm. The kind that reminds you how long it took to get here. It's strange to think about. An airport that took 30 years to open, now moving millions every year without a hitch. But maybe that's what makes it so powerful. It's not just an airport anymore. It's proof that even the most flawed beginnings can end in flight. Because that's what Brandenburg ultimately became, a metaphor for the country that built it. Precise, flawed, stubborn, and determined. It fell again and again under its own weight, but it never quit. It refused to be erased. It learned, rebuilt, and finally took off. Not just as a transport hub, but as a reminder of what patience, persistence, and accountability can achieve. The same halls that once gathered dust now hum with life. The same tracks that carried ghost trains now bring travelers from across the world. The same departure boards that displayed nothing for years now flicker with hundreds of destinations. It's not haunted anymore. It's alive. And when you stand there watching a plane rise into the Berlin sky, it's impossible not to think about what it took to reach this point. Decades of failure, a country's pride tested, billions lost, but also redemption earned. Because in the end, Brandenburg isn't just the story of an airport that finally opened. It's the story of a dream that refused to stay grounded. And maybe, after all the waiting, that's exactly what Berlin needed. Not a symbol of perfection, but proof that even the biggest disasters can still learn how to fly.